Thank you for attending our fall safety seminar. So the safety committee is hoping to have a session each semester. We've done with chemicals on how to safely dispose of them and how to enter them into the system. And we've had lots of requests for both 157 as well as the McNeil Teaching Labs. So we figured that we would invite something that we should all embrace, food safety, to bring a food safety expert, not within our department, but with the University of Minnesota. And Mark will do his own introduction, but thank you for attending today and enjoy the presentation.
Good afternoon. So that's me. I've been here on campus since December of 2006, which is quite a while. I came from, actually, I came from City of Long Beach Health Department. I was there for 9 years. Came briefly to the city of Minneapolis in the Section 8 housing program, which was probably the worst job I ever had in my life. And it was interesting. And then my predecessors at University Health and Safety that actually my position as university sanitarian is like the grandfather position for University Health and Safety. In other words, the university, when back in the 50s, they actually had sanitarians go off campus to look at housing to make sure that the housing was meeting standards for the students. They were university owned, so that kind of started the whole department of environmental health and safety. And one of my predecessors was at the university for 35 years. And then my co-worker, Janet, she was here for 14 years and then she retired. So I did have a co-worker for a while, but that's just another story. So I've been on my own, which I cover all the campuses. I have oversight of the pest control contract, wells. See what else is in there. Plan review for facilities. If they're being built, I review all the plans, inspect them during construction. I also look at residential hygiene, but there's not a lot of that going on because this is typical for a university. The program is well funded and it's well staffed. It's not like for instance with the city of Minneapolis, when you're going to Section 8 housing, you're always chasing down property owners to get stuff taken care of, and so there is a need for inspections there. But here, no. And then I also have oversight of the swimming pool safety. So I do a lot of stuff. And then one of the more time-consumptive things this time of year are all the special event food permits that come in from student groups, which I saw there were some questions regarding that. So my educational background, a little bit, you probably saw that a little bit, Cal State Long Beach. It was a college before it was a university, backgrounds in marine biology. And then my graduate degree is in biology. And actually, as I was talking earlier, we had an EPA grant that we're looking at toxicity of heavy metals to marine annelids and developing standard laboratory cultures for these things. So that's kind of, and my major professor was kind of an icon with indicator species in the marine field. He maintained a laboratory population of standardized polychaetes that he would ship around the world for hydrocarbon studies, toxicity studies. And he got pretty well renowned for that. And he was participatory in this massive lit review that came out every year. But he passed away. He was 96 when he passed away, and he was an Oregon beaver. He is from Coos Bay area, Oregon State. And with that much biology background, that made it easier to become environmental health specialists because they look for larger background in basically biology or some other science that's germane to public health. And so you do sit for an exam. And I actually had to sit for an exam here in the state because there wasn't reciprocity between Minnesota and California. But I can attest that the California exam was much more rigorous and in-depth. So the test here was actually, I wouldn't call it a breeze because it's been a number of years before I'd taken it, but yeah, the California exam was pretty comprehensive. So the title, Food Science and Nutrition Lab Hygiene, I was kind of puzzling this whole am I going to move ahead or no? I should be able to just hit enter, right? And it should move ahead.
I think you gotta get rid of that maybe.
Oh, there we
Yeah.
go. Oh,
And
okay.
I think maybe this works as well.
Oh, okay. All right. Thank you. Yeah. So I was still kind of struggling on exactly like what in a lab setting, because it's just, it's not really my role. My role is really as a regulator. So pondering, obviously there are some safety issues involved. But in terms of exposure, I was kind of left with the like so I think I'm looking at it as more of a workshop kind of thing, because I'm trying to get feedback on exactly what the risks are here. What are we really looking at? What do you really do in the labs that rise to the level where you really need to have a review of the procedures? And so I was, and I guess part of my questions there were like, well, how does it get this way? I mean, I mean, certainly in a retail food facility, you wouldn't see this. So there's a culture that needs to be explored there. So these are some of the questions that came forward to me. How can I get my students to practice food safety in class? I know how to do it on a regulatory point of view. Basically, you cite them. If you know, out in the real world, you would find them, or you go to a city prosecutor if you don't get compliance. But what we're trying to do on campus, even with the student groups that have events, there's still the hammer that can be brought down. In other words, if you go through some of my materials, there's a threat that the ability of the student group to hold more events is dependent upon how closely they adhere to the university standards at their event. And escalation can go, it can go as far as provost, but typically it's handled through student union activities. There's a director over there that's somewhere in between the provost and student groups that can, get student groups to conform. Typically, I haven't had very much pushback. Occasionally I do get some pushback by student groups or a vendor that's on campus, which I always find coming from a regulatory side on the outside world. Not that I've never had pushback, but in this particular instance, some of the instances I've had, they are puzzling to me. I'm going like, so where do you think you're going to go with this pushback? I'm the one who's approving this event. Basically I'm writing your license. So if you want to leave the campus now or later, you can. But that hasn't happened very often. And most student groups are, I have to say, a coworker was asking me about, she seems to be particularly frustrated this year. And so she asked if I'm frustrated, and it's a little bit different because the students are back. We've had a 2-year kind of a hiatus from a lot of different things being thrown in your direction. And I have to say that the food permits that are coming in from student groups are very well written. They're following the instructions. They're being detailed in how they're going to conduct their event. And it looks like it's all in conformance with university standards. So I've got to be very pleased about that, because the processing time it takes, if it's a complete description of how they're going to handle the food, it takes me just a couple minutes to process it. But if I have to go back and forth with questions like, what are you going to do? How are you going to do this? How long is the food going to be out of temperature? How are you going to serve it? It easily triples the time. So I've been really pleased from that point of view. But there has been, obviously, throughout the whole public realm of how do we get compliance? If we have time, we'll get into some of these, like this one here. We'll get into that. But so it's really sort of like, it just is like food science, nutrition, lab safety. Maybe it's just more like a theme. Again, I'm kind of questioning like, what are we really trying to do here? So how do you get this going? Kind of looked like a workshop here. I mean, I have some ideas, obviously, I've looked into, and obviously, there is one county that their food safety enforcement model really isn't enforcement so much as it is educational. It's probably the only one in the state that does this. And if you look at the year-over-year reduction in terms of violations, you can say it's a really good model to have an educational rather than the whip approach. Some vendors do need the whip. Other ones, if they just get some good carrots now and then. And I give out carrots to student groups when they do submit an excellent food permit application. I will send that along to student groups that don't say, this is what I'm looking for, because a lot of times they don't know what I'm looking for. And so I'll use those examples, and I usually maybe send back a blue ribbon or something on the reply email with their approved permit. So I don't think shaming is really a good way to go about it. I think mostly in my presentation today, a lot of the stuff that I guess I put into the scare. In other words, like, what are you doing? You know, what, don't you know? And maybe they don't, well, that's just fine. So that the education part is. So one of my questions is, are there SOPs and GMPs developed and required for classes for students that are making food? But it seems like the risk is lower because they're making it maybe for themselves or for the class. So I'm not going to get excited about that, but that doesn't mean that you can't embrace that particular concept of sanitation is a good way to just conduct things. Again, particularly if you're going to go into the food business, you know, why not start practicing now? So, and we'll also talk a little bit about the behavior change program. And this kind of starts with the beginning of the semester. If you're looking for change, it's not going to happen in 1 or 2 years. It may take a couple of years, but self-assessments are great. We'll show some examples of that. Big thing is, so once you start asking questions, then it helps you identify some of the barriers and why they're not. Why can't you clean that countertop or clean your dishes? Is it a time issue? And so you get some idea of what you can, how you can correct it and implement the changes so they good behavior and remove the barriers. Seems simple enough. Now with your colleagues and your coworkers, maybe shame works, but I don't know. So what are we really doing here? I don't really know. The way the state looks at a high risk facility has typical control for safety, potentially hazardous food, passes through the danger zone, 41 to 135 now, although there are no pathogenic bacteria that grow over 128, so we got a fudge factor there for you. More than once before consumption. So are we doing anything high risk in any of our labs or in our processes? I mean, it would help you focus on where the attention needs to be given. State defines medium risk as typical for safety. Potentially has food passes through the danger zone once. In other words, somebody cooks a burger and passes it over the counter. That's a one-time pass through. So 2 times is a process where you're going to cook the food, you're going to cool it, and then you're going to reheat it. So it's going through the danger zone twice. So that's looked at the high risk place. And then the state conveniently defines low risk is neither 1 or 2. Pretty simple. So that'd be like coffee. Although coffee, MDH just had a little presentation. So cold brewed coffee is an issue now because it will support pathogenic bacterial growth. So some of these places that are doing cold brew has to be done a certain way over a certain time frame. So maybe coffee is not a good example. Maybe selling bags of Fritos is more like it would. So that's part of this kind of work group thing. And I mean, and this can be ongoing. I mean, if I get information from y'all, maybe I can come up actually with something that like UHS offers in terms of like a really like a lab safety food science package, you know, that will be on however Cherie wants to put it on her website, you know, but the more input I have, the more specific it can be and the more helpful I can be with it. And this was interesting. So what do we want to go over to McNeil Hall? This came in this morning. So I see all the pest complaints on campus come through me too. I get to see them all. And this was actually a presentation the webinar put on by Cornell, which is the university for pest control. I mean, that Cornell is just this powerhouse for pests. So what I learned of that is that these guys, they don't urinate normally. They're like little cats. They spray. And so it aerosolizes, which is this. And this is kind of back to what happens in the lab, and if you're not cleaning and sanitizing properly in between, is that salmonella will hang around for a while. Normally, the thing that hangs around for a while, which we'll see, is norovirus. It'll hang around for 4 weeks, pretty hardy. But typically, salmonella it's enteric, so it survives. Although it's enteric, and actually it's systemic in fruits and vegetables, which is why cut tomatoes and cut fruits are considered potentially hazardous temperature control for safety food, because they'll support bacterial growth, and it comes in, and then you have no idea if your facility is hit with that. If you get a bad crop of tomatoes, strawberries, well, that's usually more surface, and because there's no kill step. You're going to be, you know, victimized with upstream contamination. There's absolutely nothing you can do. So in the industry, a lot of companies have contingency plans in case that happens, how they're going to mitigate the bad press and so forth and so on out of that, because upstream contamination out of their control can happen in this brand protection. We spend a lot of money on brand protection for these. So mice crawling around and urinating on the counter, I don't know. Who knows that room? Room 187.
Not one of our teaching labs, but close enough.
Okay. So this was in my office when I came to campus. This is the golden rule for me. It's kind of quaint, it's old fashioned, right? And this is what we want from our students that are making food or learning how to, you know, prepare food in a sanitary fashion, is this. How simple. Maybe I can end with this slide. This is the goal, right? It looks actually kind of medieval to me, but anyway, this is a good message. And then this is what we're trying to avoid. Oh yeah, don't want that. Oh man, I really don't want that. Oh no, that's a definite no. But I actually use some of these on food permits that come in. I'll actually stamp them with these to kind of cement a point of, hey, make sure that you temp the food, that you know, I don't really recommend charcoal briquettes if you get a propane grill. You know, there's a lot of other things that can be in place on this, because ultimately we don't want that to happen at all. So that's what we're trying to avoid here, is unintended consequences. This is always interesting. So this is more like the scare tactic. I mean, if there's more of this information, your incoming students, people that are working in a food lab, just be careful. So this is more of the scare thing. So, but this is a range, 35 to 48. It was pointed out in an English publication, is that they're developing this off of an algorithm, how they're estimating this. They're not doing counts on this at all. So if you change, there's a constant. If you change that constant, you change this immensely. And do you think they're really using good science for that constant? Nope. So it's really kind of who knows, but there's a lot. But one thing that is kind of finite is that. That's a finite number. That they have a pretty good idea on that, but they don't break it down or are, was it a high, how many of these are highly susceptible population? How many people don't have health issues? But it's a contributing factor, maybe not the primary factor, but it's still a fixed, it's a better number, I think, than when you say, oh, 48 million people get sick every year. And you're like, oh, really? Huh, let's change that concept a little bit. I can get it down to 20. So it doesn't look so bad. But that's a good scare. And these are the 5 main causes. And they've been year over year about the same. So when you think of back to the risk factors in the lab, do you guys teach HACCP?
Students do take a food safety course.
So,
Tonya, you had the one that.
so at least they're familiar with the HACCP. So,
In the principles, we touched it on bit on HACCP.
okay, yeah.
Yeah.
'Cause- So, right, yeah. So you identify the hazard, how to mitigate the hazard, verifiable and all that. But this is, so typically, even when it has a, I mean, you're going to have a step where personal hygiene is going to play a role. This, I guess, would be one of the focuses on our teaching labs. What are they really doing in between? Like the picture that was shown, like, that's kind of a mess. This obviously is if you're a high risk place, you're gonna have more of this potential when you're cooling and reheating food. This is a medium risk in power cooking. If you don't cook it right, that's where we go wrong there. And this, what do people do? I mean, who's really getting food from unsafe places?
For free.
Well, I would put this on my ingredient list. Just I'm thinking there might be a problem there, but I think when it came to City Long Beach was identified as one of the most diverse cities in the country based on the probability of having a different ethnicity as a neighbor. And so we had lots of markets, and then I would go in those and look at those. And if I didn't see an English label on that food, it was gone, because that was one of the requirements. Is anything sold here has to have a label in English in it. So if somebody's buying only puke and using it as a ingredient item and it does not have any English on the label, then that might be food from an unsafe source. Probably. More scare. So this is what I kind of go through these pretty quickly in terms of how low the infectious dose can be. 18. That's not very much food left on a utensil or on a tabletop. And that's where what's the reservoir? Human beings. Got nothing but vectors running around in these labs. And actually this becomes more interesting because there was a couple years ago, a university researcher who was looking at these incidences of a norovirus food outbreak. We have 4 people at the same table and only 3 of them got sick, but 1 of them didn't. Turns out that the person that didn't get sick probably was O negative. Because the gut cells mimic the blood cells, so they're lacking that polysaccharide that makes a person O negative. So somehow norovirus doesn't like those people. So that particular person can be shedding forever, let alone somebody who's had it, has recovered, and has been symptom free for 24 hours. There could be Mr. Norovirus running around, and which is fine as long as Mr. Norovirus doesn't turn into Mr. Poopy Hands. So that's food code always. Just about everything in food code has 2 layers of protection. In other words, if you prevent an ill employee from coming in the first place, that's 1 layer. If that goes wrong, if he comes in, but he's washing his hands properly and using gloves properly, then that's an extra barrier. So there's usually 2 protective steps written into food code. So when something does go wrong and there is a foodborne illness outbreak, something has really gone wrong because they've stepped over two checkpoints in the process. So something's really gone wrong. Salmonella, I have also seen some literature where it says as low as 10 organisms. Typically, again, it's kind of in cherry, so it's pretty wimpy, 145 degrees. It's not quite ubiquitous, but in terms of critters running around, just about anything that's alive has got a potential for that, which is the baby spinach and the spinach problem we have with produce and strawberries is deer getting into the strawberry fields, birds getting into spinach fields. And I think Del Monte was the first big fresh produce company that got into this on-site monitoring and verification. In other words, they have to make a decision if they're going to take that crop from a grower right away. So they need real-time data in terms of has there been contamination or not. And they actually had one guy for a while that would just sit there monitoring input from their growers so they could make that decision right away. We're not taking that crop because you show that you are people out there show that you didn't like your produce wash area wasn't sanitary enough, so we're not going to take that crop. So they had to make that decision really quick. So that was the first company that really did that. It was a very interesting presentation. That was a number of years ago, probably about 8 years ago now. But again, it's still pretty low dose. 1,000 bacteria is not a giant puddle. I mean, that's just very, very, very small. Clostridium, yeah, this one. So this is one of the ones that is ubiquitous all over the place. Those are their spores. It's hardy. Again, this is people that are learning to make food and participate in the food service industry. They have to know that these guys are pretty hard to kill. And again, we carry them, bring them right into the lab, potentially. And they're pretty nasty. People who's got a C. preventions, the toxins that they produce and they're fairly heat. Most of these toxins and bugs put out, like Staph aureus, are pretty heat stable. You're not going to cook them away. And this is really interesting too, the variety of dehydrated processed food. So the stuff's out there. So even if it's a one way, say you've got some rice, and you're just going to heat it and serve it to somebody, then that's a potential temperature issue right there for not raising the right temperature to get rid of those guys. That's pretty hardy. Survive boiling for 6 hours, but they do form spores. And this is the wimpy one because it's enteric. It only really lives inside the gut. But it's pretty virulent, only 500 organisms. I mean, 1/3 is a pretty low kill count. Can't survive that very well. But the interesting thing about Campylobacter, which I learned when my son had Guillain-Barré, is that a Campylobacter infection can result in Guillain-Barré because molecular mimicry between the myelin sheath of your nerves and Campylobacter must look the same to your immune system. So they go right after your nervous system and start eating away at the sheath, and therefore your nerve signals are going every which way, and then you're paralyzed. You can't move. You can't orchestrate your legs and limbs. And that happened to my son. My son, he was his MRIs were very dramatic. You could see the inflammation around the nerves exiting the spine. And he was under serious attack by his immune system. Fortunately, outcomes for younger people that have a lot of growth hormone is really good. But the classic cases, really poor outcomes, are from, there was a veterinarian up in Northern California who insisted on raw milk. She got nailed. Her recovery was not, she was over 50. Her recovery was, I don't think it was ever complete because of that, because she lacked the growth hormone to get everything going again. So it can be easy to kill, pretty much know where it's going to come from, chicken. So I think that one's pretty easy to control. Staph aureus, that's even though it doesn't form spores, does put out an enterotoxin, the classic case of staph aureus was in California. There was a centralized school kitchen in Northern California where they made a lot of food there and shipped it out to the district schools. Well, there was a cook who, lack of better term, lost a scab. So when he's making a spaghetti sauce, it was put, so it was improper cooling. So the spores germinate, well, there was still enough many organisms alive to produce toxins. And so when it went out to all these schools, a bunch of kids got sick. So of course, when they got a hold of it, and they once Epi identified that it was a spaghetti sauce, they tried to culture live critters. They couldn't. There's nothing live in there. It was a toxin because toxin is heat stable. But again, we're bringing it in. This is really so. In the anterior nasal passages, 50% of us have them. Intermittently 30% versus like 20%. We're all over. And that's not a really big infectious cell. It seems like a lot, but that's in terms of surface area. That's a tiny bit. These are some of the bugs of note. We're always hear about listeria. And this is in a laboratory setting. This is one of the issues is the chlorine biofilms. So you just can't, if you have your chlorine bleach and you're just wiping it down without cleaning it with the surfactant first, potentially you're missing listeria. You're not going to get it. It's just going to hang on there. And I thought this, there's outbreak associated with the coleslaw. This possible cardiovascular is associated with use of antacids because your gut pH goes up. So you're not really, your gut isn't really killing these guys. So some of these bugs they really do a good job of making a living for themselves and making it miserable for you. 165, kind of high temp. But that is one of note. This is the one that I caution student groups against probably the most, that and E. coli when they're cooking their burgers. I always recommend pre-cooked burgers, pre-cooked chicken breasts, if they can, if the group can afford them. But this actually one of the only outbreak on campus that we had, College of Education Human Development, homecoming. When was that? 2012. Anyway, I laugh, but it's like I didn't approve the event. It was a unlicensed vendor, but it was somebody who the CEHD wanted to use. I've always used this person, and this person had just passed their serve safe exam. And then she temperature abused the rice. I knew right away what it was once I started to get some information in. The state took over. When I tried to get more information, they said, well, that's an active case. She wound up being fined $10,000 by the Commissioner of Health. She appealed the verdict. She lost the appeal. And the appellate court said her offense was so egregious that they weren't going to overturn it. So yeah, it was rice. It was a rice dish. It was temperature abuse. Because, and this is what I tell my student groups when they say, oh, we're just having rice. They go like, oh, really? Well, 50% of the rice, the uncooked rice before the rest it's got bacillus in it. So if you don't cool that right, or if the establishment doesn't cool it right, you're going to get toxins from that, and you're gonna chow it down, and you're gonna come right back up with a fairly short order. We're usually within 30 minutes. And this is, again, in terms of the lab, this is really a nice little treat for this guy. Adhesive nature of its endospores. The stuff sticks. It's not quite a biofilm, but it sticks to stuff. So if you think you're just kind of going to do the little with chlorine bleach, that's not going to do nothing. You really need to get that surfactant on it. And it's turning out to be nastier and nastier as they look into this bug with this incriminated anthrax-like progressive pneumonia. Oh, that sounds like something I want to have. No. Fulminant sepsis. that sounds pretty bad too. Devastating central nervous system infection. Oh, no. So this is really a bad guy, and it's pretty tough. Something to keep an eye out, again, particularly because it's one of our foods that we eat a lot of, rice.
So.
Yep.
Acidity does not kill plasmosis, so pH2,
Mhm.
so even the cooking when you add spices or something.
Yeah, I mean,
It's a very common in Asian countries, the main outbreaks.
since it is ubiquitous, you could probably guess that it's going to be pretty hardy, that it's going to survive, like a high acidity in a pond or something, where you might get anaerobic layer that's putting out hydrogen sulfide, so it's going to acidify it, but that bug still hangs on because it can. But I talked a little about this as one of the, in terms of, well, what do we do? How do we affect change? And this Partnership for Food Safety Education, they're the people behind Fight Back. They actually have, and I mean, I'll compile all my references, that'll make available where I pull these things from. But these are, can I pull up one of them? So one of the interesting ones was this washing raw poultry. That's what I talked about, interviews, trying to get a feeling for what's the barrier there. So I think either this one or this one. FDA had a pretty big effort back, I think, in 2013 to stop rinsing your poultry. Just stop it, because you're spreading it all over. And so sure enough, I think like 3 years later, they said it went from something like almost 90% of people were washing their poultry down to like 67 to 70%. Wow. Wow, effective messaging, right? If only our messaging could be that good with our students. But then they looked again 2 years later, it stubbornly was staying at 67% and actually creeping up to 71%, where people were starting to wash their poultry again. Huh. They're kind of like, well, that message works. So that led to really starting to look a little more creatively as in what things, what tools, what techniques you can use to affect behavior change. And these are, I just saw one of them. I saw one of them a couple of weeks ago. And they're pretty simple. They're really not super gray matter, but they have some pretty interesting research in them in terms of this observational study. Let me see. Can I look at this one? Can I go back to the? How many go back to my list? Let me see. Get out of my. I want to get back to my folder.
Oh,
Oh, there it is.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Okay, so let me see which one do I want to look at here. So yeah, so this is the one where understanding barriers. So you do your own little mini one, start a semester. If you go through this and see some of the techniques they're using, and put together a rubric to kind of figure out what might be the barrier, why students aren't going to get involved with this. So there has been a lot of work done on behavior change. I think that's out there that you can use for your students. Let's see, can I get back here? Let's see. Yeah, let me just close this one here. Okay, yeah, I want to close that one. Oops. Just
I'm
want
trying to get back to the.
I'm just,
PowerPoint.
yeah, I just want to, well, let me just get back here. So. That's in the meeting. So,
To make it small again.
oops,
I think it's a different one. Yeah, that one.
this thing doesn't have any buttons here.
I think you just click the thing, yeah.
Oh, there we go. Oops.
If you go back to here,
Down here.
yeah, click on that.
Oh, so there's my click right
And,
there.
and then this is the presenter view screen. Click on that one.
There we go. Oh, it's built into the pad, isn't
Yeah,
it?
okay, it's
Okay,
working.
there we go. All right. So let's see what we know. So this is. Oh, okay. So very shortly after I came to the campus, my assistant director, Paul Allwood, who was with State Department of Health, he got hooked up with 3M. Their very first, they were rolling out this ATPA swab samples with luciferin and luciferase with these light beams. So we had a public health graduate student. It was really interesting because what they did is they went around to the retail places and they looked at surfaces, and then they swabbed them. So they made a subjective observation first. Did that surface look clean or did it look dirty? So turns out the ones that even looked clean, I think at least 50% of them did in fact have elevated ATP, that they weren't. They have actually plenty of potential bacterial activity on them. So just appearances was not a good measure. And even things like doorknobs, they sampled tabletops within dining facilities, utensils. And so one of the recommendations that came out of it was that, particularly for cutting boards, is that cutting boards, sometimes some of the ones that look like they need to be replaced are pretty scratched up with knives and look kind of dirty, because they had gone through a dish machine. The ATP activity was, and they measured it in standard light units, I think is what the data was in. And so those would show like they look dirty, but they're actually pretty clean. So that's why one of the techniques that, if the department is so interested in, especially as a learning tool, is to start using some swabs, maybe the beginning of the semester, when students first come in and you have a little discussion about, could please, public health and common courtesy requires that you please keep the place clean. So that might be a tool to use. That, and I think I'll mention this later, and also just a simple glow germ. Glow germ is really, it's so dramatic to use that as a powder that fluoresces, and then they do a hand wash. You do a 20-second hand wash, and you have a little black light, and they come back in and go like, oh, I guess I missed that. Which is one of the changes in food code that happened, is that they pretty much got rid of allowing not to use gloves. You have to have a pretty lengthy specialized process and reason to apply to not use gloves for ready to eat foods. It used to be kind of optional. California, it's always been optional. I don't know if they've changed since then, but when I was there, things were a little different. The first go around with a food safety law was California Uniform Retail Food Facility Law, CURFL. Careful with CURFL. So, but then they dropped the retail part of it. So I would go out on inspections in Long Beach, and if there was a nonprofit group giving away hot dogs, I didn't have any law that could enforce temperature abuse or anything there, because the law was retail. We weren't retailing it. So well, okay, eat at your own risk. But yeah, that research note is a good little tool to have for your students and keep in your pocket. You can say like, well, look, looks clean, but it's not. This is interesting as well, because it shows from a consumer point of view, people spreading their chicken juices all over, particularly seasoning bottles as they're working in the kitchen. They're just, light switches, refrigerator door handles. It's just, once they start rinsing their chicken, it's the contamination is going all over the place. But you guys use bleach, right? See, this is good. This is a great little paper too. Look, once you mix it up, and this is, the variation is either 35 degrees, 20 degrees, in light or out. Start out with 200 ppm, but actually in the spray bottle, even up to 128 days, it's still 100, which is the requirement. It's at least 100. The people that, unless somebody just got a nervous habit, they want to keep mixing up new chlorine, but they don't really need to for that. But so this is really good validation that you're, how often, maybe you're going to keep track of how often you mix up your chlorine. Well, maybe we just need a input sheet that is every 2 months. We need to, unless you use it up and mix it up again. I prefer bleach. One of the classic outbreaks, and this led to I think a CDC white paper on this, is it was in Indiana. There was a restaurant chain, it was a major chain. They had a line cook show up to work, felt ill. He upchucked and died in the kitchen. And then, he's going home. So they rushed in there, restaurant did, cleaned her all up, sanitized the surfaces, and open for business, right? 3 days later, 50, 60, 70 people called in sick. So they're calling their lawyers, right? I hate to be at the company and have, 50 lawyers calling me. So then, well, who springs into action? The local health department comes in. Well, let's look what's going on with that. So we clean and sanitize. Well, okay, so let's do it again. So 3 days after that, a food service worker, she gets sick in there, and then more complaints come in, but they're cleaning and sanitizing. They're sanitizing with quat. They're not killing the noro. So that led the CDC saying, here's the deal, because the Midas aerosolizes, that if you have in a kitchen space, if you have somebody vomit in there, their recommendation is that you sanitize with bleach in a 25-foot radius. So this is why at the stadium, the operators there, they have been told that if somebody vomits in that stand is closed, because you cannot, you has to be closed until you can sanitize that whole, 25-foot radius is basically a concession stand. So they know this. They actually, several years ago, during one of the games, it was too hot because the stadium is not air. There is no temperature control in the concession stand. They actually had staff get sick in one of the stands. But anyway, so that's my love bleach. Bleach is good. So it's kind of back to that, is it with allergens? That's another thing that's like, well, that's gonna kind of get you sick too, even if it looks pretty clean, but I don't know. We don't have a swab for that. We have no way. It can take as little as 300 milligrams of, I think the paper I was looking at was peanut butter, for instance. They call that cross contact, so it gets mixed in with something. And so that's a very small amount, 0.01 ounce. What's that look like on a tabletop? Probably not much. So that's why it's important we actually wash before we sanitize. not just for the 3-compartment sink, but for surfaces as well. And there's no problem with, if you want to wash and then wipe it down with a clean paper towel before you sanitize, that's fine. Or if you want to rinse a little bit with just, straight water, but not from one of the non-potable faucets. Hold back on that. But I would say that's like a best management practice, the SOP, that you're not just sanitizing, that you're actually doing it in at least a 2-step process, that you're washing and sanitizing. So back to the workshop part of it, you guys are running your labs. What do you think? I came up with Google germ, surface swab, questionnaires to look at barriers, and then the sky's the limit there, really. But think about it again. I mean, we can actually have an open dialogue, and again, best circumstances, we can put something online at UHS that this will be available to everybody. And quickly, we can go through some of the food code changes from 2019 that might affect what you do and how you communicate to students. This goes back to California, Mr. Scadman, requires that for restricted clothing with wounds, provides specific instructions. How this will affect operators. Actually, a long time ago, I saw there was a great list. It had food code in it, and for each food code item, it had the public health reason, which was really good for the Freddie Fooey operators that would be like, well, why got to do that? Well, they didn't have an answer for it. You do it because here's a public health reason. I thought that was extremely useful. The list I have is probably out of date, it's probably been updated, but that's a very handy tool to have, because one of the things I found in enforcement as a regulatory agency in general is you're always fighting for credibility. If you go to a place and you just tell them, oh, you got to do this, and you don't have an answer why, there's not going to be good behavior change there. There has to be a reason behind it. So I thought that list was really, really good for my sanitarians that I was directing in Long Beach, that they had this with them for the common violations, so that they give the operator, because believe it or not, operators would actually identify a young inspector and try to push back. Oh, imagine that. And so they would have some ammunition, say like, well, no, this is why you're doing it. I'm not making this up just to be a pain in your ass. 24 hours. See, this is except for Mr. O negative, the norovirus. He's going to be shedding forever. So this is something to think about. This was a big deal with Airmark, is that they had these bloodborne pathogen kits, these little things like this. I go, no. State has a poster with kitty litter, blah, 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 PPEs, the whole 9 yards. I put it in a 5-gallon, a Homer bucket, and you keep that there. And I'm not going to accept those. So you have to, this is what I'm doing. Again, this goes back to the vomiting incidents, it's everywhere. So they actually, that was a change. That was never in the food code before. We had to have a good response kit for that. This is science-based. I like how some of the food code is actually science-based. Almost half of it is really outrage-based. We're trying to keep the public outrage down. But this is actually science-based. Like I said, there are no pathogenic bacteria that will grow above 128. So by lowering it from 140 to 135, that made a lot of sense. And that's the same thing that happened with the cold holding temperature. For years and years and years and years and years, it was 45 because they didn't have the technology. It was very expensive to keep stuff at 41. So they didn't, so the code didn't reflect that. So when we know probably better, the colder the better, because Listeria grows quite happily at 38 and 32, between there. So, but that's incredibly expensive to do that. So once the technology changes, well, let's make it 41. And you'll see a lot of packaged foods come in, refrigerated meats and so on, that will actually say 38 on the packaging. So they know that you're going to have more longevity. You're going to make that week or whatever, however you're going to hold that product before it actually starts to grow to a bad number of organisms. So again, it's one of the things, it's science-based. This is a big change. Used to be 4 hours, but now if you've got 6 hours, as long as it stays under 70. But I still think the cooling from cook temp, finished pasteurization temp, put it that way, down to 70, you still have 2 hours, and then from 70 down to 41.4, probably still a good thing to follow rather than go run it out to 6. You know, probably higher standards always better. I had food, I had fish at the stadium this last weekend. I can't figure out why it was this way. It was 64 degrees and a reach-in cooler on 6th floor. It had came from the main kitchen up to the walk-in cooler that was at temp. And it just went down the hall and it was all going to be cooked into fish tacos like at halftime. I go like, well, how did this get to 64? If it came out of the kitchen at 41, came up to a walk-in that was the right temperature. So I just went to the chef and said, you need to figure out what happened here. I didn't throw it away because it was still under 70, you know. If it had been 70, I would just have checked it all. Like, can't, you know, inspectors don't like mystery food. If you can't tell me the history of that food, if you don't have a temperature log, then I'm just going to check it. That's actually required now. Hand wash your signage by a sink. It's a beautiful thing. So this is what I was talking about with direct hand contact. You can do it still, but you need a very detailed option for food establishments not serving. So you can't serve a highly successful population and not wear gloves. Basically, you can, with the right application, you can if you're not serving a highly successful population, but other than that, you're wearing gloves. Yep. Oh, yeah. This has been a big thing on campus. You know, this is, especially with COVID, people picking up the food containers and taking them back, and you know, as always, is it allowed? Yes, it is allowed. They have to be cleaned and sanitized. They have to be in good repair before they're put back into service. With my student groups, if they're going to do hamburgers or chicken breasts, I say, send me a picture of the thermocouple you're going to use, and if it's not a fine tip one, I said you can't use it. It says the thick tip, you know, bimetallic ones, chili, that's fine. But if you're cooking burgers, I got to see a small tip. This was a slide from our local FDA retail food specialists, and I think this has to do with, we're just going to do this. In other words, the backup is built in the code. It's like a three-legged stool. So hand washing for too long, drugs help more, not having a built into the work is the best way. So with those 3 legs in place, you're pretty well protected. I think that's it. Questions about, what were the questions that were about using some of the food labs for? I don't particularly have a problem with that. It's not a licensed facility. So how the state looks at, like, for instance, a potluck. If you're having a potluck and you're using a licensed kitchen, it can't be considered a potluck because you're using a licensed facility. But if it's not a licensed facility, but it's a community kitchen, which I would deem it as a community kitchen, and I would approve that kitchen. I've approved community kitchens from some student groups because they want to make food off campus. Let's say like a church, it's no longer a childcare center, but they have a commercial equipment. I'll allow that with the requirements that they send me pictures of the equipment, and that I can get somebody that is ServSafe certified to be on site. And I get their license number and their certificate number and everything for that. So that's how I look at these kitchens and our spaces here, is that basically they're community kitchens. And there's one over in PWB too, which I talked, the nursing program was using it. And it is pretty full on commercial, so they want to know what they could do there, so you can do anything in here. But I'm still not gonna license it. I think the old VFW, they had a little kitchenette up there too before they tore it down and made HSAC out of it, but they had a nasty little, it was okay, you know, but they never asked to use it for outside services on it. Any other questions? Like I said, I'll be happy to put together a reference list, send it to Kendra of everything that I use. I've got it all there and just have at it, take a peek. And I would just recommend use as much scare tactic.
You can use those in.
Yeah.
Teaching.
Yeah. I think so. I think that's what you, because I'm just without talking to the students and saying like, why don't you want to, you know, like, what is the barrier here? You know, which I think that's such a good idea to do some initial inquiries to get a feel for your class. So like, how's this class going to be? Are you going to be the messy Wessies? Are you going to be the good kids and things like that? But just to get a feel for you know, how they're looking at that. I mean, I see all sorts of papers about food safety attitudes of students. There's a ton of literature about that, not necessarily in this country, Saudi Arabia. You know, there's a lot of places around the world that are looking at food safety attitudes of students. So there's a lot of information out there, but I guess the crux of the matter is how you translate that into behavioral change. So
Thank you.
you're welcome.
We do have a few at the back, questionnaire, if you have any suggestions for future presentations or.
Some of the response in my teaching.
Is that correct?
Principal, somebody, so, yeah, come on.